Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Kate, the CEO of LaunchVic. I'm going to be the moderator for today's session. As we always do LaunchVic, I'd like to wish the traditional owners of the many lands supporting us with us to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. We'd like to welcome everyone who's attending this session as well, including our LaunchVic directors, our colleagues at the Departments of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, in Finance, as well as Premier and Cabinet in the Victorian Government, as well as government colleagues from other state and federal departments. I'd also like to welcome esteemed startup ecosystem leaders, investors and general fans. We're delighted you can join us here today for this very special event, which is to mark the launch of the report that productivity is not an accident. The economics in Victoria's, the event is being recorded. LaunchVic is the state government startup agency, and we commissioned this report in late 2019 for a very specific reason. While we recognise, along with many other insiders of Australia's startup ecosystem, that our sector is increasingly important, we believe it doesn't get the attention that it deserves as a critical component of our economy, and this is increasingly so as our sector grows. The report that's being launched today importantly myths some of the myths around the misconceptions of the startup economy. We've assembled a wonderful lineup of speakers and panelists. So to get started, I'd like to welcome our first speaker, Penelope Mckay, representing the Victorian Minister for Innovation, the Honourable Martin Pakula, without whose support this important piece of work would not have happened. Penelope is the Associate Director in the Department, Associate Secretary in the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, and will be providing opening remarks. Penelope, welcome.
Thank you, Kate, and it's a pleasure to be here today with all of you. I recognise that we're all sitting in different places at the moment, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, wherever that might be. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and elders from other communities who may be here today. In terms of what I'd like to cover today, I'd like to firstly talk about LaunchVic, and then I'd like to talk about the Victorian startup economy, and finally thinking about the future and the opportunities and challenges that are presented at this unique time in Victoria with the current pandemic. So first of all, by way of opening, as Kate said, I am here representing the department, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to celebrate the launch of Deloitte's report, Productivity is Not an Accident, the economics and impacts of the Victorian startup ecosystem. So with this project, LaunchVic is continuing the important task of monitoring and improving our understanding of Victoria's startup economy to better inform people like myself, public policy decision makers, the government and the public service, as well as the broader private economy, to unlock the potential of Victoria's entrepreneurs, who in turn will drive the creation of jobs and economic growth in this future. And what better time to be talking about that than now, when the issue of job security is a real issue for so many people. In terms of Launch Victoria, it's a Victoria's startup agency that was established by the Victorian government in March 2016 as an independent agency responsible for growing Victoria's startup ecosystem. And since its foundation, it's had such a record of success. It's activated more than 110 programs, supporting 320 individual startups, upskilling almost 5,000 aspiring entrepreneurs, and partnering with the Department of Premier and Cabinet to launch the GovTech Accelerator program, Civic Labs. And just as an aside, I am pleased to note that the third round of Civic recently opened for applications, and this program offers startups opportunities to develop solutions to public sector challenges and pathways to securing government contracts. Government procurement is a powerful lever, particularly during periods of poor private sector confidence. So it's excellent to see this unlocked in for Victoria's startups. Most recently, LaunchVic announced the establishment of 4 new angel investment networks that will deliver much needed early stage investment and mentorship to the startup sector. In terms of the Victorian startup economy, the report that we're launching today estimates that Victoria's startup economy contributes an estimated 4.6 billion in revenue to our economy and 2.4 billion in value added. It employs around 18,900 people, which represents 0.7% of Victorian employment. From other research, LaunchVic has identified approximately 1,800 technology startups in Victoria, with 1 in 5 being in health, wellbeing or sport. It is growing at 23% per annum and has been identified as the 5th fastest growing economic system in the world for its stage of development. We're home to 11 unicorns, the highest number in Australia, and collectively these companies are worth an estimated 35 billion in market valuation. It's a diverse group of people who'll be building our future startup companies that are successful. 1 in 4 founders are female, 1 in 2 have 1 or more parents who were born overseas, and the average age of a founder is 37. These results reflect the significant growth of Victoria's startup ecosystem over the past few years, with the support of LaunchVic and the backing of the Victorian government. In terms of the future, excitingly, the report models that there's a plausible growth path of increasing startup density in Victoria in terms of ecosystems globally. And this has the potential to add an additional 15,000 jobs each year over the next 20 years. But as the title of the report suggests, these outcomes will be by no accident, and it will be the result of careful and deliberate investment and culmination of a delicate and complex cultivation of a delicate and complex ecosystem. In terms of our current situation, it's unquestionably a difficult time for the Victorian economy and a difficult period for Victorian startups. But there's also a lot to be optimistic about. We know that downturns can be great for producing successful startups, and there's plenty of knowledge and expertise among Victorian founders about running and scaling businesses in capital poor environments. WhatsApp, Slack, Instagram and Uber were all founded during the GFC, and it would be great to look back in 10 years' time and think what household names might have been produced right here and now in this time that we face at the moment. In conclusion, as this report reflects, Victoria's startup economy ecosystem is well placed to be a force for growth, and we look forward to seeing what potential is going to come over the next few years. Thank you to LaunchVic and to Deloitte for this report. It gives us all as policymakers, as participants in the ecosystem, as potential founders, as drivers of the economy, a lot to reflect on and build on. I hope you enjoy the rest of today's session.
Penelope, thank you very much. And it was to hearing remark in the Times. Introduced Dr. Pradeep Philip, the head of Deloitte Access Economics, who's going to give a summary of the report before we jump into a panel discussion. Pradeep will be known to many of you, having made a significant impact in public policy with experience leading at the highest levels of government across both state and federal governments. He has deep expertise in economics, and he's held roles including Director of Policy in the Prime Minister's Office, Secretary of the Department of Human Services Victoria, CEO of LaunchVic, not to mention other positions as well in government. Welcome, Pradeep. We're really glad to have you here today. And I'm going to share my screen.
Thank you very much, Kate, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for this opportunity to be here with you today and to share with you some of the insights we have gained from our recently commissioned report. So let me start with a little bit of context. By most measures, economic growth of the last 80 years or so, since the end of World War II, has been good for prosperity. Over that time, we've seen enormous developments in poverty alleviation, curing disease and illness, in incomes growth per capita and in wealth creation. But you know, students of systems theory will tell you that just when things look like they're at their best is when systems are at their most fragile. If you look at economic growth over the last 80 years or so, one of the features is that trend growth rates have been steadily declining. From the 1960s compared to the 1980s, compared to the post-GFC decade, trend growth keeps coming down. What this means is that the sources of economic growth post-war have been running dry. The challenge for economies around the world over the last little while has been to look for new sources of growth, for new sources of productivity in order to drive sustainable economic growth and jobs for the future. So notwithstanding fantastic macroeconomic outcomes over the last 80 years, we see in the trends the need for something new. And if we look around us, we see this new happening around us. Technological change, particularly as related to information communications technology, the power of that mobile and the internet, has been unleashing a wave of creative destruction, as the great economist Joseph Schumpeter called it, across all industries, all business models, simultaneously. And that's the key, simultaneously. From banking to legal services to agriculture and manufacturing to professional services to health to retail. And this activity is all about the incumbents suddenly realizing that a consequence of oligopolistic market structures is that less and less attention has been paid to consumers in favor of mass-produced offerings of large players simply seeking to exploit scale. But the innovators and the entrepreneurs have found their time, and all around us we see this activity. So while we are living in the best of times, reaping the rewards of 80 years of an economic growth cycle, we are now living in the best of times for change. Because this is how economies grow and evolve over time, through innovation and the efforts of entrepreneurs to commercialize, to break business models, to create new markets, goods and services, and indeed to lay down the platform for productivity. And as we heard from Penelope, of course, in the last few months, Australia and the world now looks very different. The world is trying to work its way out of a public health crisis while feeling the impacts of the resulting economic crisis. Global economies, including Australia, are facing economic decline not faced since the Great Depression. The International Monetary Fund has predicted a 6.7% fall in growth for 2020, when in February, only 2 months ago, our economic outlook was set for growth to be steadily picking up over the next 2 years, even after the dampening effects from the drought and the summer of bushfires and flood. Uncertainty now surrounds our current economic trajectory, just like COVID-19. So the challenge in these times is the same as before, just more acute, for governments and business to find sources of growth and productivity to create a new and higher economic growth path, one which generates jobs and secures prosperity into the future. Now, it might surprise some online today that our understanding of innovation has been undergoing quite a bit of change in economics in recent times. You know, there was a time when we thought of innovation of something which just happened, like manna from heaven, as one famous economist once put it. But we now know that startups and startup ecosystems are that bridge between the current economic growth path and the creation of a new growth trajectory, which will drive recovery, income, and jobs into the future. But this just doesn't happen just like that. Nor does it happen when you're overly directive or prescriptive. In isolated cases, maybe, but from a public policy perspective, the frame for thinking about innovation and entrepreneurship is what can you do to maximize the probability of success. Think ecosystems and the infrastructure which supports entrepreneurs. Think supply chains which reduce transaction costs and provide a service uplift. In other words, innovation and hence productivity are no accident. The startup and innovation ecosystem of economies can steer the medical and societal advances required to reopen our economy to new pathways of economic growth from the situation we find ourselves in today. COVID-19 has already seen a rapid transition of our physical world to a virtual world. Think of telehealth and online learning, and indeed our forum here today, which are becoming the everyday norm. We cannot unlearn what we have now experienced. Think about the scientists around the world working around the clock to expedite the development of a vaccine for COVID-19. Think of the new markets which will open up, not just in health, but around a world of testing and indeed mobility, and in sectors like manufacturing and so forth. Businesses are coming up with new ways to keep producing existing products despite disrupted supply chains, and are even creating new ones. So startups are well placed to take advantage of these new conditions to drive opportunities, and in doing so create productivity dividends for the economy. And this is the reason why we're all here together, and the reason for being for LaunchVic. The bottom line of our report is this. 1, the Victorian and startup ecosystem is in a good position to drive growth, income and jobs for the future. 2, that Victorian startups will create thousands of highly skilled jobs and play a central role in Victoria's economy and recovery post-COVID-19. 3rd, that it takes an ecosystem carefully crafted to maximise the probability of success. 4, that our numbers are conservative in our report because potentially the greatest value of innovation and startups and entrepreneurship is in these spillovers that it creates and the culture of risk-taking that it engenders. And finally, that innovation, startups and entrepreneurship are economic phenomena. So let's go to some specifics. If I could have the next slide, Katie. Over the past 3 years, LaunchVic, starting with 60 million over 4 years, has successfully embedded the startup ecosystem into the broader Victorian economy and is supporting a transition from Victoria's traditional economic base to a more diversified economy and is supporting job creation. The economic impact analysis of Victoria's startup ecosystem found that in 2019, the startup ecosystem here generated around 4.6 billion in revenue and contributed 2.4 billion in value add to Victoria's economy. That's roughly around 19,000 jobs. In terms of size, to give it some proportion, that's about 0.6% of the Victorian economy. And for context, the arts and recreation services industry, a well-established industry, represents around 1.1% of the Victorian economy by way of comparison. The modelling and analysis we undertook has been informed by a comprehensive database detailing close to 1,700 startups across Victoria, provided by LaunchVic, which informs the size of the startup industry. And we know that the average revenue and employment across the startups is around 3.6 million and 14 employees respectively in 2019. We can move to the next slide, please. Right now, Victoria's startup ecosystem is on the cusp of globalisation, with the ecosystem being recognised by Startup Genome as an ecosystem showing potential to make the global top 30 ecosystems within the next 5 years. And the density of Melbourne as a city, combined with the startup ecosystem's physical and network assets, has allowed for the formation of a globally recognised startup ecosystem. The Victorian startup ecosystem is not only of size of around 1,700 startups, but it's also diverse, with startups in 16 different subsectors, with over half of Victoria's startups in health tech, enterprise tech, e-commerce and digital tech. The health sector is the largest within the ecosystem and is internationally recognised, followed by enterprise tech and financial services. The latter, of course, dominated by the fintech subsector, which offers key service and products such as peer-to-peer lending, unsecured finance, robo-advice, cryptocurrency, digital wallets, stock trading, and budgeting apps, to name just a few. And the majority of Victoria's unicorn companies, as we heard from Penelope, are also in these sectors. 3 in health tech, Mesoblast, Carnival Pharmaceuticals, and Polynovo. 3 in e-commerce, Envato, REA, Car Sales. 3 in enterprise tech, Seek, Cultureamp and MYOB, and 3 in financial services, Judo Capital, Airwallex, and Afterpay. Now, while the diversity of sectors is important, what we found in our study was that location is increasingly playing a large role in the dynamic relationship of startup ecosystems, and we're seeing that emerge in Victoria. We undertook spatial mapping of all Victorian startups, and the economics of agglomeration plays out in Victoria as we would expect, with startups primarily located in and around the Greater Melbourne area, with a few startups also situated in the northeastern and southwestern regions of Victoria. What we also found when we looked more closely at the Greater Melbourne area is that startups are located closely within 2 kilometres of the central business district, and that startups tend to be in areas which are serviced by public transport. Startups are particularly concentrated within and around the city loop. This concentrated level of activity is significant. But importantly, while startups are choosing to locate themselves based on accessibility, we found that they are not clustering by sector. What this tells us is that startups are taking advantage of the benefits of the local Melbourne startup ecosystem, having access to transport, resources, services, and networking opportunities, as opposed to situating their startup next to another startup in the same sector. If startups and employees are located within a close proximity from each other, they benefit from collaboration with like-minded colleagues, employees and firms surrounding them, learning from those who have different methods, different skill sets, and different ideas. In this context, adjacency of sectors and skill sets and knowledge seems to be playing an important role. Now, this agglomeration of economic activity has synergistic effects, and productivity spills from one sector to another, leading to virtuous economic growth. If I could have the next slide, please, Katie. So as we look to the future, we've modelled the potential impact of the Victorian startup industry over 20 years under 2 plausible future growth paths for the startup industry in Victoria. One of moderate growth and one of high growth. Scenario 1, moderate growth explores the impact of this moderate growth of an increase in density in the number of startups on productivity and the flow-on effects to the broader Victorian economy, including the impacts on industries who are end users of new innovation. Scenario 2, high growth estimates about the potential economic impacts and how they change if we achieve a higher startup density sooner. If we go to the next slide, please, Katie. And what we found was that in scenario 2, a higher growth scenario, that if we embrace innovation, foster entrepreneurs, and increase the role of the startup ecosystem, we create jobs and growth. In scenario 2, Victoria's gross state product increases by 7.6 billion over the next 20 years, adding on average around 15,700 jobs each year. It is increasingly becoming clear that maximising the probability of success of entrepreneurial endeavour lies in the dynamic interactions and collaboration between economic actors and stakeholders, underpinning a constant feedback loop to form a startup ecosystem. Such an ecosystem is what drives 1, innovation to fuel long-term cycles of productivity gains, 2, the demand for services in a highly productive economy, and 3, the creation of high-value adding employment. All are factors which make an economy successful, sustainable, and improve standards of living. All are factors which have driven Victoria's economic success over the past several decades. But as we continue to experience the turbulence of 2020, we know that economic growth trajectories are not a given or a constant, and productivity is not an accident. It is ultimately powered by deliberate innovation and creativity, given economic form in startups, entrepreneurs, and the ability of existing economic organisations to adopt, adapt, and facilitate the diffusion of new ideas into the market. So let me bring my comments to a close. This is a key area for government economic policy agendas globally and in Australia, and an area for all key players in the startup ecosystem, from providers of venture capital through to research institutions, and is one which requires an understanding of the processes which give rise to innovation and the translation of this into economic outcomes. Given the current state of the world, never has it been more important to embrace innovation, to foster entrepreneurs and support the role of the startup ecosystem in delivering economic growth and job creation. Now is the time to solve declining productivity, to support job creation and work towards creating the sustainable economic growth pathways in our community, in our economy, dividends of our economic success. I might stop there. Okay.
Pradeep, thank you so much for that very insightful presentation. We're now going to move into a panel discussion, and we look forward to exploring some of the themes that you raised in there, very important themes, I might add, in a bit more detail. Before I begin, I'd like to just start with a little bit of keeping. Everyone's very familiar with Zoom webinars. There's a chat channel and a Q&A channel. I'll be doing my best to moderate the Q&A channel. Please do send through questions, and we look forward to including them in our discussion. There's also a chat channel if there's anything you want to share or have any questions, any information that you'd like to share with people, links, etc. Please feel free to use that channel. I'd now like to move into introductions, and I'm going to start with someone who needs no introduction, Paul Bassett, founder of Economic and Global Capital. Victoria's most founders of two of Victoria's most exciting companies, who are definitely in that scale-up territory, to bring a practical example of and perspective to the discussion. Stan Kroonenberg is the co-founder and CEO of leading edtech scale-up, The Cloud Guru, and Alison Hardacre is the co-founder and co-CEO of leading health scale-up. Welcome, everybody. Perspective. You bring a unique perspective to the importance of the startup as one of Australia's, as a VC. I'd be very interested in your perspectives on Pradeep's presentation and some of them develop over the last few years.
Yeah, and it's, thanks, Kate. It's really, really important series of questions, and thanks to you for the work you do in you know, really helping catalyse the ecosystem, and Pradeep's work is really, really important in that context. And I think there's a, you know, it's sort of no coincidence the way that we're having this conversation today in the sort of in the middle of a pandemic, because I think, you know, clearly over the next few years we are going to need to create, you know, more jobs than we've perhaps ever created before. There's going to be a need to not just create any jobs, but the sort of the highly productive, highly rewarding jobs that a lot of early stage companies create that are going to contribute to sort of productivity growth in this state, in this country, which has obviously been a challenge for us the last few years, and has been a challenge for all countries, all developed economies for some time, productivity growth. So the context is really, really important. And, you know, ultimately, and I guess reflection for me is, I was looking at my credit card bill the other day, and literally it's a slightly unusual time at the moment. But first, I was pleasantly surprised at the amount, and that was probably a reflection of isolation. But more relevantly, I was a bit horrified when I looked at my bill, and it was full of, you know, Uber, Netflix, Google, a whole range of other, Spotify, a whole range of other global giants that are winning markets globally, not locally. And we're operating in a world where software businesses, and Sam and Alison, their businesses are doing this. Software businesses are by and large winning markets globally, not locally. This is about global, not local winners. They're disrupting existing incumbents in this part of the world and in every other part of the world. And there is relatively little that we can do. And Pradeep talked about this. Creative destruction is incredibly important part of our society in terms of increasing productivity, in terms of increasing prosperity. But even if we wanted to, there isn't a lot that we can do about the rise of Netflix, as an example. There isn't a lot we can do about the rise of Uber, as an example. And so in order for Victoria, in order for Australia to maintain the prosperity that we've had for generations, we need to produce our share of global winners, our fair share of global winners, because it's these organisations, the plurality of jobs, and often the majority of jobs, the plurality of jobs, the highest paying jobs, the most productive jobs, are typically based where the organisation is based. Facebook employs about 15,000 people in the Bay Area. It employs 130 people in Australia. Generates, despite what it says publicly, generates about $2.5–3 billion of revenue in Australia with 130 employees, pays virtually no tax. We need to produce our share of global winners like our Wallex, like a Cloud Guru, etc., if we're to maintain our prosperity and our standard of living.
Thank you, Paul. And we certainly at LaunchVic couldn't agree more. And we certainly want to see those high-skilled jobs created in Victoria. I'd turn to our scale-up founders because you're living and breathing this. I'm going to start with Alison. Alison, I'd love about your journey at Happy and how you are a company that is here in Victoria.
Sorry, the internet just dropped out there. Can you just repeat the end bit there, the end question?
I'd just like to hear a little Alexi and jobs in Victoria.
Sure. So I'll give a quick summary of Halaxy. So we provide practice and patient management software to healthcare practitioners, as well as consumers directory to find a practitioner, as well as personal health record. So we have two halves of the market in healthcare, and by doing so, we can make healthcare effective, efficient, and accessible. We operate now in 130 countries around the world, and we have an office here in Australia, in Melbourne, as well as in Ireland. And we were looking to set up an office in North America, a little bit delayed by coronavirus there. And so what we're seeing is we're wanting to employ as many people as possible around the world. We have 30 people in Australia. We're spending, because we're in healthcare, including telehealth, spending a lot of time at the moment recruiting. And so we would love to grow as fast as possible. There's a little bit of a hold on some of the recruitment at the moment, and partly that's because of the constraints in the capital environment.
Thank you, Alison. And we will come back and touch on that a little bit more. Sam, I'd like to hear a little bit about your journey to Cloud Guru, which is equally as incredible. And one of the things I've heard before is how you started. Could you give us a little bit of insight into how a Cloud Guru came about, your early days of entrepreneurial exploration on this journey, and also where it's come to today?
Yeah. Hi. So I started the business in 2015 with my brother, Ryan. We actually founded the business from our houses in Melbourne and London. And we were really trying to tackle the problem of making high quality tech education as accessible and affordable as possible for people, and to give people access to lucrative careers in tech and solve some of that skills gap problem in our industry. And we saw that cloud computing was the future of tech, and we focused our efforts there. So we built an online learning platform, self-service training courses that let people build their tech skills in the cloud and learn how to use Amazon, Microsoft's, and Google's clouds. The focus for us really was just how do we make training fun, engaging, and hands-on? Our ethos is really simple. The question we asked ourselves is like, why is training boring? Most people think training is boring. Nobody wants to do it. Why can't it be fun? Because the technology and the subject that we're teaching is actually fun and interesting. And then it was that, and that training should be continuous and in bite size, and it's something you should be doing all the time. And so that's why making it interesting and engaging is important, because you need to make training something that people actually want to do, so that they will do it regularly. So I built this originally in my house in Melbourne in my spare time to get it off the ground. We built the business out of cash flow initially in the first couple of years. We took our first VC investment, our Series A, about 2 years in. And yeah, the approach resonated. We're now the largest cloud computing training provider in the world, which we're really proud of. We've taught cloud to over 2 million people globally. Only about 5% of our business our sales are in Australia. The rest comes from overseas. And we've had a lot of success in the enterprise as well, because our focus has been on how do you train people at scale. That works really well. That's the problem that enterprises have. So yeah, that's been our focus. So we've been going for just less than 5 years. We've now got about 400 employees globally. We're in Melbourne, Austin, Texas, Dallas, Texas, and London. We have about 4,000 businesses who trust us to run their cloud training programs, and we're in 50% of the Fortune 500 in the US. Yeah, so that's kind of the cliff notes, the summary. I would say on a personal note, I'm really proud to build a successful Aussie business. I came back to Australia after spending 10 years overseas. I came back in 2010. And one thing that kind of struck me, and I was a little dismayed that there wasn't as many great kind of Aussie products and tech companies as I'd seen overseas. And I really wanted to be able to have an ecosystem where Australians can stay in Australia and still work on projects and innovative products that have global impact. Yeah, and I think the first few years of starting a business are really challenging, and we should be supporting our startup ecosystem and our founders. If you look at COVID-19 as an example, sorry, I know I'm going on, but just to finish up, we're seeing a lot of success in this era. I know a lot of companies aren't, but if you think about why that is, there's a trend towards online learning and there's a trend towards cloud computing that is only being accelerated by this COVID situation. And, we're very lucky in that regard, but it's also because startups invest in where the world is heading and not where the world has been. That I think, it's important for Australia to be making investments and starting businesses that are looking towards the future, so that when things like this happen, the growth is coming here and not going to overseas global businesses.
Sam, thank you. And again, could not agree more. And Pradeep, when we pulled this presentation together, we had a discussion about who we should be having around the table. And it was no coincidence that we chose EdTech and Health Tech as organizations. That was pre-COVID when we did about the right importance of EdTech and health. Here we are, 3 or so months since we had that conversation, and never has it been more important to have these wonderful Australian EdTech, health tech companies. Where do you think these sectors are going to go to, and what other industries should, are critically important to the Australian economy as we look to recovery from COVID-19?
Kate, thank you for that. And by the way, what great kind of examples we just heard from Alison and Sam. And I think what Paul talked about was the importance. We can't just let this slip. This is, if we care about our future, right, we actually have to get on the game of nurturing and doing everything we can to build growth and scale for businesses in Australia. And it's not just the startups in their own right, but what they deliver for everybody else. And that is the greatest economic benefit that comes out of the startup ecosystem. We can see that in health. And we see it also from the examples of Sam and Alison. What they're doing is solving real problems. And they're solving it by and large from the perspective of the consumer. What is it about that gives convenience? What is it that helps them navigate the system quicker, better, easier to get access to what is really important, whether it's education, whether it's health, etc. Too much of our economic system has been built with people on the supply side saying, I will build and they will come. And this mass-produced, impersonal kind of offering. And what we're seeing now is startups, particularly in health and education, actually flipping this on its head, saying, what is it that you need? What is it that you can't get? And you know what? We've got the ideas out there. We'll connect. And people like Paul go and assess these things and bring them together with finance and expertise to say, hey, you know what? You don't just start up a business out of nothing. You actually have to have a bit of discipline. You have to have a little bit of kind of good finance, not just access to finance, but what you do with it. You've got to have good product development. You've got to have good research. You've got to have good marketing. And this has got to be continuous. And so, Kate, if you think about what LaunchVic does, it helps build this system, wraps around these systems of services around people who have ideas, who are trying to make a change. And I think this is the story of the ecosystem. And this is how we go from getting more people in the door, into the funnel, so to speak, and then helping them grow to establish themselves, and for some to scale up and for some to grow even better. And health and education are front of mind right now. But you think about enterprise tech, if you think about the finance system, there's an enormous amount of change that is occurring and is yet to come. And these things will have catalytic effects for economic growth and jobs for Australia.
On that point, one of the things that we're seeing is obviously in the last few months, there's been a rise of telehealth. But at the same time, you know, in February, we're across all types of appointments. In February, less than 1% of our appointments in our software platform were online, whereas it's now 14%. So 1/4. But what that means is that 86% of appointments are still face-to-face. So the nature of healthcare is changing, but it's not changing as rapidly as we would think. But I'm hoping that telehealth will be a permanent fixture. But what we're also seeing is you look at the Australian deaths from coronavirus, it's only 102. We have an office in Ireland, it's 1/10 of our population, and yet they've had 16,000 cases, just cases. And you know, you extrapolate that out to the Australian health system, and it is, the Australian population is astronomical. But what we're seeing is that the Australian health system is something that can be exported. And that's one of the reasons why health tech is so important. But each health system is different. And so if we're going to build global health tech businesses, we need to understand that from day one. A lot of investors are looking to fund and support businesses that are global from day one. That's quite hard in health technology, but that's one of the reasons why I saw a question before, why technology is so important. You can build software for one person, and if you make it scalable and flexible enough, it's relevant for the whole world. That's why there are so many startups that are technology based, and Victoria is a really welcoming environment for that. And you know, we've seen change over time, and it's become even more welcoming over time.
I might just add to that briefly,
Thank
if that's okay.
you, and absolutely, please do.
Yep.
Please go ahead.
So just that question that Alison referenced on, you know, so much innovation is software based, you know, what about high tech and manufacturing? I think that the reality is that software is the underpinning for a lot of innovation across a whole range of sectors, whether they involve manufacturing, you know, physical goods. Look at, you know, an example, I guess, Amazon's warehouses, or the robotization of manufacturing plants. And I think that's where the ecosystem is important. So it's not just about it's only software businesses that we're encouraging, but you have to have the software expertise to enable those businesses. Tesla's an amazing example of that. I mean, that's basically applying Silicon Valley software engineering practices to the production of cars, fully autonomous self-driving cars. You can't do that without the ecosystem of software engineers and software science to be able to support the new innovative technologies across a range of disciplines.
Thank you. And I'd like to pick up a point there. You talk about these new technologies, Sam, and I'm going to throw to Paul. I attended a seminar that you gave last week where you were talking about the funnel, and Pradeep's just mentioned that as well. How important is it, and what's the opportunity right now to grow early stage companies? And also to pick up a question from Cara Waters around what's the importance of accelerators and incubators in this environment, and how important is it that the ecosystem is funded?
Yeah, so and there's a few things in there, Kate, and a lot of really important issues, and hopefully I pick most of them up, and if I miss anything, let me know. You know, a healthy ecosystem has all of the ingredients in place, and the core or ingredient is the founders. It's people like Alison and Sam, because you know you can have an amazing ecosystem, or you can have a very good ecosystem with some incredible founders and not necessarily all of the other ingredients in spades. But you certainly can't have a great ecosystem without incredible founders. And so, first and foremost, you know, if you think about it, there are a handful of places in the world, and the most obvious are the Bay Area and Israel, where a very, very large proportion, not all, but a very, very large proportion of our best and brightest people gravitate towards startups. That's kind of just that's the industry of the place they're in. You know, if you're in Hollywood, you want to be an actor or a producer. If you're in the Bay Area or Israel, there's a good chance you grow up and you want to work in tech. You want to start a And so I think one of the things for us is we don't have a talent issue in Australia. We just need to, if more and more of our best and brightest gravitate towards saying, I want to build a company that's trying to change my corner of the world in the way that Alison and Sam is doing it, or join a company doing that, you know, in a product role, in a sales role, in a software engineering role, etc. So that's the most important ingredient. Incubators and accelerators, I think we're actually doing pretty well in Australia. You know, the jury is a little bit out. I mean, we haven't seen that many of the most exciting companies in Australia emerge through incubators and accelerators. There may be a little bit of a lag effect. There may be a little bit of a lag effect there, because obviously, you know, it's probably been in the last 5, 6, 7 years that we've had far more incubators and accelerators in the market, and obviously it takes a while for companies to emerge, but they are certainly part they're certainly part of the mix. Capital is obviously really, really important. It's a mix of local VCs, it's a mix of global VCs who may be investing in our geography. We've had a good chunk of VCs from overseas, including in Sam's business, who've backed him, a couple of great funds that have backed his business. It is strategic investors, it's angel investors who particularly can get involved early on and get hands-on a little bit and help the companies, etc. So it's all of those ingredients. And I think as we look at the ecosystem, and I compare it to 20 years ago, well, 22 years ago when we started Seek, I compare it to 8 years ago when we started SquarePeg, we've made a lot of progress, but so has the rest of the world. Everyone is trying to do what we're doing. And so even if you're moving forward at a decent pace, that just means you're going sideways. You actually have to go forward at a very quick pace to actually gain a competitive advantage. And secondly, you know, I think we're doing it well. We're moving in the right direction, but I think we can go a lot faster and really sort of supercharge those key enablers around policy, around entrepreneurs, around capital, around accelerators, and build a world-class ecosystem. We're going in the right direction, but I'd like to see us get there much more quickly.
Share that thought, Paul. We would love to see the it's a real opportunity now to. I'm going to throw to our founders now. What supports would you like to have had as a founder that you have, and also what is your other ecosystems globally? So I might throw.
I'm not sure who Kate asked to go first, but Sam, do you want to have a go? I went first last time.
Fine. Sorry, I couldn't really hear the question, Kate, but I think you were talking about what support would we like to see, or would we have liked to have seen as we're scaling up the companies? Is that right?
Correct. Yes.
Yep. Yeah, I think honestly, for me, I think that the two biggest challenges for us have been skills and, frankly, real estate. I think talking first about skills, I think hiring is always our number one challenge. Getting more technically skilled and capable talent. And I think this is where the ecosystem comes into it. You need a combination of both talent and experience. If you can hire people who are credentialed and qualified and they've got all the right degrees, but they haven't actually been on the journey and lived the experience, it's not enough. And yeah, this is where the ecosystem matters. So what I typically hire for, what we look for when we hire people, especially leaders in the organization, is who's been on a similar growth trajectory before, because high growth companies are a unique beast, and they're very hard work, and they require a lot of commitment, and they require a lot of proactive planning for, hey, the company looks like this now, but it's going to look very different in a year from now. And what are we doing now to get in front of that? So the biggest thing we look for is who's been on this journey before. Let's say it's a journey from a $10 million revenue to 200 million revenue. Who's been on that journey and experienced this and can give us advice and plan for the future. And that's where if we have an ecosystem of companies in Melbourne, in Australia, that have done this many times over, then you've got talent who've seen this story before. And I think that helps. When we opened our US office, we chose Austin, Texas, specifically because there were so many companies in that city that had been on that that journey, that revenue growth journey that we're looking for. And we've been able to hire really talented leaders there. So I think, there's certainly Melbourne has that as well, but I would say maybe not as much as some even smaller cities in the US who have that experience. So I think there's that. And then I think there's skills. People have talent around for what we do, software as a service, product and engineering, but then also the go-to-market side of things, sales, customer success, marketing in this space. The last thing I'd touch on is real estate. Nobody seems to talk about this. I'm not sure why, but real estate for high growth companies is a nightmare. It's a big blocker because leases are typically 5 to 7 years in Melbourne. And when you're growing 100% year on year, you've typically got 18 months in a place at most. It takes 9 months to find the place, fit it out. By the time you move in, you've got to start the search for your next place, and you've got to make these huge capital investments and deposits to move into these spaces. So co-working spaces are great and they give that flexibility, but that's really when you've got, 0 to 20 people. If you've got 100 people, 50 to 100 people, and you're doubling every year, real estate becomes a real challenge. And I actually don't think there's a solution out there right now.
I'd 100% agree on that. We've just been through that about 6 to 9 months ago, and we'll have to go through it again in 18 months. And we're already starting to think about that. In terms of the question, what support would we have liked early on? I think it's twofold. The main one was capital. We started this business, launched it in 2013. There wasn't really a capital market back then in Australia. And over time, that's improved. What we found, though, was that there were trends in terms of capital. So at first, capital supported businesses that were quite niche and focused on one particular sector, etc. So they were going to only ever achieve a small impact. And, that was fine because it meant that investors could flip it quickly. But when you've got a big global goal, and I know Pradeep's report talked about the importance of founders having massive ideas, massive focus, rather than a small idea. When you've got a massive goal, like making healthcare better everywhere, it was harder to get investment. And then there were some difficulties as well that have improved over time as society's improved in terms of, say, supporting women in technology. What we've found, though, is that we've been very, very efficient with the capital that we've got. So we have competitors in our sector that have had 20, 30 million investment. And yet we're the largest in our sector in Australia. And we're hoping to be the largest sometime soon globally. And we've done it with a lot less capital. But what challenge that has led to has been one in terms of talent. So probably up until 2 or 3 years ago, there wasn't really a respect, I suppose, from employees in Australia generally for being in a startup. It was seen as if you'd failed in the big corporate world before you go into a startup. And then probably a couple of years ago, startups became the new black, so to speak. And it became easier to recruit. However, one of the things we learned was that startup employees in Australia, they don't so much care about shares. So share options weren't that attractive, but we needed to pay market rates in order to compete with other employers for the right employees. But at the same time, similar to what Sam was saying, when you're looking to hire somebody in a high growth venture, you need all the same skills as in other businesses, but you need a capacity to handle pace. Sam and I were looking to double our business every year, and that's not for everybody. And it's something we can train in people, but only to a certain extent. And so as there becomes more maturity in the startup world, there'll be more of those people that Sam was talking about, people who've had that experience who can support other startups as they grow from a culture, mentoring point of view, as well as financially.
Thank you. And I'm going to pick up on a point you raised around capital and throw to the venture capitalist in the room. Paul, is now the time to be investing? Are there opportunities in market as a result of the situation we find ourselves in?
Yeah, and I want to come back to sort of, for the moment, Alison's comment about capital, because I think, we've seen a good, say, compared to when Alison started business 7 years ago, we've seen a good growth in the amount of venture capital in Australia, but it's still really low. And so we're still, it's not just if we use benchmarks like, you know, the West Coast of the US or Israel, which are very, very high benchmarks. If we use benchmarks of Germany, UK, Singapore, even New Zealand, on a per capita basis, we still have less venture capital in Australia, excuse me, than those places. Now, it's a hard thing to measure because there are funds like us that are Australian funds that also invest offshore. There are offshore funds invest in Australia, so it's not a perfect science. But I would certainly echo the views that there is scope for more rather than less capital coming into Australia. And in particular, I saw there was a question someone asked about advanced manufacturing. In non-software areas, in life sciences, in advanced manufacturing, in food, there is even a greater need. We're actually doing okay in software. We could do a lot better, but in other areas, we particularly need to do well. Now to answer your question, look, we think the next 2 or 3 years is going to be like the period, you know, 1995 to 1999. So if you, venture capital as a modern industry is about 50 years old, or late 1960s, West Coast of the US, is really as it emerged as a professional structured industry. There's been a lot of good periods for investing in early stage technology in the last 50 or 60 years, but there's been one standout period, that's 1995 to 1999 or 94 to 99. 4 of the 10 largest companies in the world today were founded during that period. If we throw in Apple, when Steve Jobs returned to the company in 97 as a company that was beaten up, that's 5 out of the last 10, largest 10 companies in the world today were founded in that 5-year period, which is an extraordinary stat. Probably don't have time to sort of go into why, but we think the next 2 or 3 years is going to be the most exciting period to invest in early stage companies since that 94 to 99 period. It's going to be obviously a little bit bumpy. There may not be as much capital coming in, which is a bit counterintuitive, given that it's such an exciting period. But I think enough institutional investors recognise the opportunities in technology. So we will see a greater flow of capital into the sector than what we saw during other crises, such as the dot-com crash, such as the GFC. So we'll see a reasonable flow of capital coming in. It may be a little bit less than what it was, but I hope it'll be okay. But in terms of opportunities as an investor, we are extremely excited about the sort of the wave of innovation that's going to occur over the next few years globally.
Thank you, Paul. And I'm going to, very conscious of time, Pradeep, I'm going to throw to you just to make some closing remarks to close out the panel and bring it home.
Sure. Thanks very much, Kate. You know, economies don't grow without productivity. And productivity just doesn't happen like that. It relies intensely on innovation and entrepreneurship, particularly when you have economic growth paths coming down and you need to jump onto a new trajectory. And the key to driving this, I think, are 3 simple things. Get the right habitat, the ecosystem. Second, lift your volume of throughput, that funnel that Paul talks about. Third, because you've got a good habitat, improve your survival rate. And we do these 3 things, we start to build density, you set off a virtuous cycle of growth, and this leads to more activity, more jobs, actually over time improves wages, and more importantly, also helps us drive our exports. So there is no doubt, if we care about economic growth, we've got to care about productivity. If we care about productivity, we've got to care about innovation. And none of this is an accident.
Very well said, Pradeep. And I realise we're right up against the wire. I'd like to thank a few thanks. Firstly, thank and the team at the Deloitte for doing this important piece of work to support the ecosystem, not just in Victoria, but Australia. Thank you to the presenters today, Pradeep, Paul, Alison, Sam, and Penelope. We're really grateful for you making the time, and thanks as always to the LaunchVic team for making it happen. Thank you for everyone for attending. What's available on the LaunchVic team will also send an email to all attendees with a link. We hope that this report will help build a stronger argument for driving support for ecosystems across Australia, more critical to Australia's future. So thank you for joining us today.
Thanks,
Thank
Kate.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for your time.
Thanks.